I am Captain Rendessa Hankins from the 86th Logistics Readiness Squadron, Ramstein, Germany. I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Brigadier General David Sanford. General Sanford is the commander of the Defense Supply Center Richmond and Defense Logistics Agency Aviation in Richmond, Virginia. DLA Aviation is a major subordinate command of DLA and is the agency's combat logistics and supply chain manager for aviation and nuclear assets across the Department of Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, Brigadier General Sanford.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Abby Johnson with the Defense Logistics Agency. Today, I have the pleasure to interview Brigadier General David Sanford about his time on the current and ongoing support to the White House Task Force for COVID-19 response. Brigadier General Sanford is the commander of Defense Supply Center Richmond and Defense Logistics Agency Aviation Richmond, Virginia. DLA Aviation is a major subordinate command of DLA and is the agency's combat logistics and supply chain manager for aviation and nuclear assets across the Department of Defense. Sir, I understand you may have some opening context to provide before we get started.
Well, thank you, Abby. I really appreciate that. And I just want to say thank you to the Logistics Officer Association for providing this honor for me to attend virtually, but to be able to participate with LOA activities. I've been a LOA member now for a couple of decades, so I'm dating myself, but it's always an honor to be part and around the Logie Nation, whether in person or virtual. Again, appreciate this opportunity. I have been part of the COVID task force, the COVID response, since 8 April of last year. Started out as a 60-day endeavor. And so we're on our fourth extension as we work through this. Not necessarily a good thing. The nation has gone through quite a bit and continues to work through it, but we're on the upswing. It's been a great opportunity, quite a few lessons learned, both on the leadership side as well as just the functional side. So happy to share and discuss our time up here.
Are you ready for the questions?
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
Remember,
so
I'm from Georgia, so I'm slow.
Okay. These questions come from around the field. I've polled the audience and taken some questions from Logies, both Air Force and DoD wide. So on a personal level, was it intimidating to be selected for that role? And looking back, did it feel bigger than it turned out to be, or smaller?
No, it's a fair question. So it was intimidating. I've never been assigned or part of a larger task force, and I've heard the term before. You're part of a White House task force, but I didn't really know what that meant until I got here and was working for Rear Admiral John Plopchek. And so the first time you're called to sit at the table with the vice president and explain what's going on from a Class 8 perspective and what you're going to do to provide PPE to frontline medical workers or ventilators or pharmaceuticals, it was quite intimidating. But found everybody very accommodating. Everybody was just very focused on the job and getting things done, trying to protect our U.S. population. So the teamwork and the camaraderie was quick. It was almost very similar to being deployed, except we were in Washington, D.C. versus the desert. Sometimes I think the desert's easier. But it was a great experience. Again, quickly able to gel as a team, which is what was important. I worked with just some incredible all-stars from across the services and from FEMA, and that just made it much, much easier.
Great. So knowing that there were a lot of different people there, not just Air Force, of course, from a leadership perspective, how did you adjust to the different cultures? Since you were working mostly with non-DoD agencies, and other outside agencies?
I think that's a great question. And I think something that may be overlooked for us as leaders within the Air Force sometimes, we're very focused on our own culture, maybe the joint, but interagency is much different. There's not just from a organizational tone, but really from an operations piece. So for example, there's a perception, right, wrong, or indifferent, at least from the Health and Human Services folks, about the DoD, about the, we come in big, we come in strong, we're kind of bullies. In fact, they mentioned to me that they were the first general, I was the first general officer that they met that didn't have a God complex, or was arrogant about their approach. And so I took that as a compliment. But what I found was the culture as far as speed, what the priorities were, how they did staffing, much different than how we did in the Department of Defense. And in some cases, they were more regimented than we were, believe it or not. So whereas we're very focused on getting the job done, and sometimes an 80% solution is okay, or a 60% solution. When you work with a bunch of clinicians, and don't get me wrong, in the Health and Human Services, our nation is very fortunate. We have some of the most brilliant scientists and doctors and nurses and medical professionals that are here. But they very much, that is their cultural mindset, if you will. So it's very much, I have a problem, so I'm a doctor and I'm going to keep drilling down on that problem until I get to the best diagnosis that I can prescribe. And that may be like the 100% solution, but you don't always have time for that. But you can't work around people and you can't work over people, which is what they expected. So understanding that culture quickly allowed us to team better, or to team build better, so that we could work with each other. So there were things to learn from them on how to do things better, things they learned from us. And so it allowed us to gel, but coming in with an open mindset is what was key. Understanding the lay of the land. And I know that's tough, because anytime we all take a new job, we're like, hey, let's take the first 30 days and kind of see what it's like around the area. But we didn't have that. So within the first couple of days, you have to assess those different cultural dynamics. And I didn't even mention FEMA, which has a different cultural dynamic. They're about getting it done too. But it's still just a different way of doing things. And so understanding how to leverage that, work that, find the strengths and all the different aspects, and then figure out as a leader how to make that all gel. That was the challenge. And so understanding that, it made it much easier to be able to be effective. At the end of the day, we want to be effective, but continue to bring everybody forward. It's easy to run a unit hard for a little while. And then the next person has to come in and kind of pick up the pieces and put that unit back together. And so we tried to bring the unit forward so that when we all took the hill, we didn't look around and see a bunch of bodies laying on the hill. We all got there together and in good shape.
Great, sir. So expanding on the relationship between medical and the DoD, do we have the visibility needed across all supply chains, specifically the medical supply chain?
From a national level, no. And so that was the first thing that was a challenge. I mean, if you want to run a supply chain, you got to be able to see it. And so you got to have visibility over it. So it's the same challenges we find on the Air Force logistics side. We don't have complete visibility. We have pretty good visibility, but not complete. And so it was even worse on the medical side, because it's a much more fragmented supply chain. We were very focused on the personal protective equipment. And so when 85% of that is brought overseas or bought from overseas, and the overseas folks don't necessarily share the data, you don't have the visibility on the manufacturing side. We had pretty good visibility on distribution, but believe it or not, we didn't have visibility to what the point of care facility had. So that hospital, that long-term care facility, hospice care, home health care. So we had to string all that together as quickly as we could, so that we could provide that visibility and make sure we were prioritizing pieces and getting them to the right place. But I've said this many times. I mean, logistics, the foundation, the underpinning is data analytics, data management, visibility. If you don't have all that, you're not going to be a very effective logistician. And so not having that on the medical side, we were fortunate enough to have some very patriotic companies who were willing to not worry about working through all the legal parameters so that they could share their data. So we were able to capture all that using a basic DoD system that we then expanded, robusted out so that we could actually have live feeds from distributors. And then ultimately we got to the hospitals, the point of care facilities, so that we could at least have the middle and to the right side of the supply chain. We still don't have visibility of the manufacturing side, which is a challenge. But as I said in the beginning, the bigger issue is all that manufacturing capability was coming from overseas. So it'd been hard to probably get anyways, even in our best days. And so as we've grown the domestic manufacturing capability, I think we'll get there. At least we have a plan to get there in the next 6 months or so. So it'll be a long-term enduring capability, but a little bit longer answer to your question, but really the key is, understanding that data, not just data visibility, but you got to have the analytical capability to move forward. And so that was something that had to be grown on the fly while you're trying to deliver material to frontline medical workers. And so one of the ways we like to capture it is, or the way I looked at it or rationalized it is, the US population, if you will, or our weapon systems that we're trying to service and support. Our frontline medical workers were our maintainers. And it was my job to get them the supplies that they needed so they could service the weapon systems that we needed them to service. At the end of the day, it took a great team effort, and we did our best with the visibility that we had. But I'll emphasize it one more time for a third time. Data analytics and visibility of the data are the key to a logistician being effective.
Sir, I just had a follow-up on that. You said nationally the medical supply chain was hard to track. How about just within the Air Force?
Well, but so that's what's different there. We've before I came in, or slightly before I came in, the Medical Service Corps took over Class 8, if you will, medical logistics management, kind of divorced from, if you will, the line of the Air Force. So they have their own processes, their own systems to provide that visibility. So I think the DoD has a pretty good job, but it's a small component. Even though it may seem like a big job, from a federal government standpoint, represent 4% of the PPE requirement for the entire nation. So that includes the DoD, the VA, State Department, Homeland Security. So it's I think we do a good job on the Air Force side, but it still it wasn't there on the commercial side or the definitely not at the national level. Because one of the things you have to think about, or what we learned, I should say, is that because many of our point of care facilities considered it almost like an inexhaustible supply, because I can buy my cheap material from China, Thailand, Malaysia, or Vietnam anytime I want, because they've always got it. But this was the first time that you had a global pandemic. So everybody was going for the same supplies. And you had 4 countries that were providing most of that for the entire world. Until other nations could stand up their own capability. Don't get me wrong, we had some capability, a small industrial base. I wouldn't even call it an industrial base complex. We had some nascent manufacturing capability in this US, but we really learned how exposed and how vulnerable we were to other forces, because folks from overseas, again, controlled most of that market. And so that just became an enduring challenge. So digressed a little bit there from your question. Apologize on that. But I thought it was at least germane to that part of the conversation.
Great, sir. Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask this one a little bit, probably longer and less objective of an answer, but day to day, what drove initially the battle space requirements? And then how did the need, or the term need even, change from day to day, month to month? And then as a leader, and in that role, how did you balance those changes?
Okay, so 3 things there. So first of all, we had to define the battle space. So unlike you could say there was a COCOM, if you will, but our battle space was the United States and all the territories and tribal nations. But the way the country is divided, if you will, from management standpoints from FEMA, there's 10 regions. So we had 10 COCOM commanders within the United States that we were working with, and each one had a different priority. And a lot of times those priorities didn't necessarily, and again, this goes back to the visibility question, didn't necessarily or weren't necessarily valid per se. They weren't the highest priority, but a lot of our priorities actually played out in the press. And so there was a lot more politics involved than we're obviously used to, at least that I've been exposed to. I'll speak for myself. And then the Department of Defense, to where a hospital in South Dakota, Sioux City, or Sioux Falls, if you will, because they're able to make a good case in the press, that then gets the attention of, in this case, the Vice President of the United States. And so then that was the direction to go work that area. So it wasn't not having that holistic view and then understanding what the true need was. Again, it goes back to visibility. Even though we got to where we needed to go, it was our priorities in some cases were driven more or more often than not from outside forces than understanding the valid need. Now, it took us till August, which I know seems like a long time in the middle of a pandemic, but by August, we had the data reporting from the actual hospitals and from the long-term care facilities. And then we could actually go back to either the administration or whoever was asking and say, well, no, we actually show that you reported that you had 30 days of supply on hand. So you're okay. We're not going to give you any more. We're going to go give it to this person that's got 3 days of supply on hand. So we had to work through that. But that was a challenge, and more so than I've ever experienced that drove where we needed to be.
Were there agencies or specific hospitals, states that requested more than their fair share?
Maybe, and so not a very satisfying answer. So and the reason being is the states were required long before the pandemic to have a certain stockpile level to support their own pandemic needs or their own medical emergency needs. The challenge was, again, visibility. We're not connected, even though there's a federal emergency management system, which is local execution, state management, federal support. Mm-hmm. Everybody went to the feds and said, hey, I need you to give me this. When in fact, the state should have been provided quite a bit of this, but because we didn't have visibility over each other's capabilities, it wasn't as synchronized as it needed to be. So a state, a lot of times on the FEMA request system, it's a trust factor. So the state requests it. I mean, and once the state emergency management official signs off on it, it's considered a valid need, and FEMA goes to work it. And so that then, since we were embedded with FEMA in the beginning, it came to us from a supply standpoint or logistics standpoint to work that with our FEMA colleagues and get things moving. A lot of time along those lines, where we could do some checks and balances, though, we were very much aligned with our industry partners. So medical distributors and medical manufacturers, not just the ones who were like all in from a patriotic standpoint, but just companies in general who were supportive and linked to us. So they would provide us visibility sometimes in what somebody really had. But also, instead of the feds having to provide everything, we could go to the commercial side and get them to fulfill requirements. And so we were able to fulfill quite a few requirements by just pointing out where the demand was and pushing them there. So that's going to sound a little weird because it's like, hey, this is a company. Don't they know who their clients are and who they can service and who needs something? No, not always. And so part of that is because they have their own priorities in the system. And it was based on historical usage. So if you're a rural hospital in northern Georgia and you've never ordered an N95 mask, and then you all of a sudden order one now, but they only have enough capability to satisfy 80% of the requirements, you may not get anything. So we had to work through that system, that allocation system, to make sure that the hospitals got what they needed. It was very complicated. It's not as simple as, if you will, what we're used to. There's a requisition that comes in, it gets processed. If it's a MICAP, obviously it has a higher priority. If it's not a MICAP, it's got a lower priority. It goes down to get filled at the base level in the depot, or then it goes out to a vendor to see if they can pull something off the floor. You didn't have that kind of capability. I just couldn't call 1-800-CHINA and say, hey, send me something. We had to find other ways to satisfy those needs. And so you consistently operated under a system of scarcity all the way up until December of this year. It wasn't until about really the first of the year that at least I personally felt comfortable that our supply chains had repaired themselves and were able to move forward. So I know that was another long answer. I'm sorry, and more than what you asked.
So near and dear to my heart, supply chain security.
Yeah.
So the pandemic you mentioned earlier brought supply chain security to the forefront, talking about other countries and everyone vying for the same same materials. This became even more evident by President Biden's most recent executive order on supply chain. What can we do in the logistics community to be better prepared for supply chain risk going forward, both in pandemic or otherwise?
So I'll admit, on the DoD side, even though we have challenges and we have bad parts that still get through that we got to pull, we do a pretty good job. On the pandemic side, it was tough. There was in the beginning, we were able to get there, but in the beginning, there was quite a bit of counterfeit property that was moved. And so the way, I'll give an example. We had one state, they bought product from a company in China. It was delivered. The top layer of product was what was bought and was good. As soon as you move down from, let's say, 2 masks down or 2 layers, it was all expired product or non-functioning. And so the state got saddled with well over, a couple of million faulty N95 masks that then they had to work through. But more importantly, that's at the expense of the people, because the people who needed the mask now don't have a mask. And so that led to preservation protocols that you probably heard about, where people are using masks for 20 times or 2 weeks for all their shifts. And so that's obviously not ideal and puts people at risk. So we ended up deploying teams to a lot of our ports and actually worked with, we had some customs teams to the Far East as well. And they were able to inspect a lot of the products and catch that before they arrived. Now, does that work as well in the Department of Defense? Obviously not, but we had to do it as an emergency here for the pandemic. And so we were able to catch a lot of things before they were ever shipped and prevent the bad material from getting into the supply system. And so it's rare now, but for the first couple of months, and part of it is everybody was desperate. If somebody actually had something and it seemed reasonable and it's the right price and they worked through it and it was legit, we took more risk than probably would want to. And so I think that gets into security. There's risk associated with that, how comfortable you have. But just like the DoD, the issues weren't necessarily with the OEMs. It was more with the second, third order tier suppliers, or the sub-tier suppliers, who were providing things and then pushing it up. So there were quality control issues that were lacking in the Far East. And we don't see that as often here in the Department of Defense. Don't get me wrong, we have it happen. We're not perfect. But the OEMs that we have have processes in place to try to capture that. Do they always safeguard the electronic pieces that people can hack in and steal? Not necessarily, but they do provide a certain amount of security to make sure that the part we're going to get is real. That type of quality assurance was not being done overseas until we were able to deploy our own folks to help. Now, to the credit to the Chinese, they were very concerned at that point and actually reinforced their own customs inspections to make sure that material that was essentially considered made in China was not slipping through and ruining the country and the nation's name for providing quality product.
But it sounds like it highlighted a potential for risk.
Absolutely, it was a vulnerability. But very much so. So it's not just a matter of, hey, the stuff's made overseas. That's the vulnerability. Maybe. If the stuff was made in our hemisphere, whether it be making this up, Dominican Republic or Mexico or Colombia or down to Argentina, as long as the right protections and quality assurance was in place, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily for when it comes to our medical supplies. But what we found, if we want to maintain the security that we want and the medical safety of the people we're trying to protect, that's what drove a lot of domestic investment to make sure that we're going to be able to make the stuff here in the United States. Now, the only side note from that, I don't know if we'll get to this later, is, and we run into this problem on the defense side, is so we're growing a medical industrial base, just like we have a defense industrial base. But my biggest concern and what keeps me up is how do we sustain that base as a nation so that 2 to 3 years, 5 years from now, when the next event happens, the material that we need to protect all our people is still viable. We're still got production capacity, we still have production capability. Because I mean, again, that industrial might is the foundation of your logistics. So I talked about how data analytics, data visibility is one of those foundations. The next is in an industrial base. You don't necessarily have to have everything right there at your fingertips in a warehouse so that you bought a bunch of inventory. I mean, it's a balancing act, don't get me wrong. I'm not a just-in-time inventory fan, but if you understand your production capacity and capability, then you have the idea or the information that's needed to determine what you should have and what you can manufacture. Because if I can spin up the property in 30 days, okay, well then let's look down the supply chain and understand what my raw material constraints are, what are some of those other constraints, so that I can rapidly expand that capacity to meet the crisis. And it's the same argument can be made if you're talking about a near peer competitor or any other type of support.
All right, sir, you've convinced us that you were the right person for this position. Why do you think DLA was the right agency for the task force?
Yeah, so not the right person, the person who couldn't get out of the room fast enough, but the agency-wise, I think it was good. So DLA touches all classes of supply, and specifically Admiral Plopchek, former task force director, was looking for a DLA flag officer that could be his deputy, somebody who could reach into the agency when needed and be able to talk peer-to-peer with our major subordinate commands. And plus, I had the relationships with our major subordinate commanders. We're all friends, and so it was able to work things out. And so, one of the main reasons is, and I should have said this first, is so Health and Human Services, much like the DoD, has its components, if you will, or its services. However, in Health and Human Services, each one is, well, there's about 12 too. Because it has the Center for Disease Control, it has Federal Drug Administration, and we have NIOSH. I mean, there's all the components at NIH. I mean, all the components you hear about in the news supporting the pandemic, well, they're all here, but they're also little separate entities, if you will, with their own contracting capabilities, their own human resources, et cetera. And there's not a OSD-like function at the Health and Human Service level to bring all that together. So they lacked the acquisition capability to buy in the bulk that was being asked for, because you're buying for the entire nation, and they weren't set up to do that. And so they relied heavily on DLA to do a lot of that. And DLA has, like most Department of Defense organizations, has a lot of great acquisition professionals. They buy things, and they have quite a few people. So they, as DLA was buying most of those things, it seemed like a natural fit to have a DLA officer up here help providing that support to the task force and making sure that requirements were being relayed very quickly to DLA so they could get on them, because it's a no-fail mission. And so you had to get on them and get on them quickly. And the other thing I'd add to Abby is, at least as an airman, so one of the things that, besides just, buying things and making sure they get to places, that's a piece of logistics. But again, there's some things that we don't make in this nation right now. And again, as you're spinning up, you're still trying to drag all this stuff from those 4 countries from overseas here. So there's port congestion issues. We have to work at Los Angeles and Long Beach and San Francisco. There were customs issues. Much of the machinery that was bought by this nation to spin up N95 mask capability comes from Germany. So we had to work very closely with Berlin to make sure that we were getting the stuff expedited and shipped here while they're working to protect their own people and spin up their own capabilities. And so having that logistics background, if you will, I think was helpful. DLA distribution, if you will, is all over the world, whether it be warehouses or they definitely know how to work ports and airplanes and so forth. And so coming together, all of that provided, if you will, a total package so we could work all these issues. I mean, there were trucking issues, and just like the Department of Defense worried and suffered with our prime suppliers shutting down because of COVID, we had the same thing. I mean, at one point, Malaysia, the entire nation was in a lockdown, and there was no glove production for 2 months. And so we had to work at how we were going to manage even further on the scarcity scale to continue to support people. So again, another long answer, sorry, but I think that's why DLA was kind of a natural fit to come up here. Other people may disagree, and I'm happy to trade with those folks.
So building on the DLA selection and then being an airman, I got a two-part question for you. Do you feel the Air Force prepared you well for this task? And can you speak to how the concept of being a leader first and a technical expert second applied to you in this scenario?
Yes, ma'am. So I think, so it goes back to what we talked about earlier. We don't, in the Air Force, as line of the Air Force officers, we don't necessarily manage Class 8 supplies unless you go work in a joint command and, that part falls under you. Like, I mean, I had to work at CENTCOM and most of the other COCOMs, or you deploy forward. But so we don't necessarily have the exposure on the Class 8 side, but I think it's narrow to look at it as a Class 8 perspective. It's a commodity. And end of the day, this is all about supply chain management, end-to-end management, and getting it to the right place and understanding all that. And, so I think the Air Force, through experience and through education, did provide me a foundation, and especially on the experiences and through exposures, both through Air Force Material Command and being able to deploy forward multiple times, especially in joint organizations where you really are working end-to-end management and more than just, if you will, Class 9 parts, as we do mostly in the Air Force. It provided the foundation that I think I needed to be helpful and effective. Was it deliberate? No, but it was. But at least it was there to provide that, again, that foundation to go forward. Are there things that we can learn from this? I think so, and it's what I highlighted in the beginning. It's not about the commodity that you manage. We get wrapped up around that sometimes. And I'll pick on the logistics readiness officers. Sorry, we're a lot of times our officers are still very focused on: do I need to be an aerial porter, supply expert? Do I need to be a fuels person? At the end of the day, it's about commodity management, and we need to focus on being supply chain experts. That's really our niche, and what flows through that. Who cares? It could be liquid, gas, it could be a box, it could be people. And so we just need to focus on how to do end-to-end management for whatever gets put in our pipeline. And that's what we need to work on. So from a leadership standpoint, this was definitely a leadership laboratory. And why? Because you're bringing it, we talked about in the beginning, you're bringing together so many different organizations to provide a whole government response. And most of them are not used to working with each other. And those who came together, again, the thought was, hey, well, this is only going to be 30 or 60 days. Nobody thought it was going to stretch out for a year, at least in the beginning. We thought we'd get a handle on it and move forward until we realized how severe it was becoming. So organizations got tired. They got tired of working well and playing nice with each other. They wanted to go back to their primary roles, whether you're commerce, I want to go look at trade reports. FDA, I want to focus more on, at least the people we work with, providing the end user certifications on PPE, but go back to their respective niche. So from a leadership standpoint, very challenging to make sure you keep everybody motivated, keep everybody informed, and which is a challenge because, I talked about just within health and human services, you got all like 12 different organizations that you got to go to, and they're not used to working together. So you got to make sure that you're getting the right information. And then they have people within there that actually impact the supply chain and affect it. So pulling them out and bring that all together so you can provide a holistic view, that was a leadership challenge. So, and keeping everybody working well and playing nice together, just to be blunt, was a challenge. And not being that overbearing DoD person, but being that person who's always nudging everybody, bringing them forward, working well together. That was the leadership challenge that we continue to work for. So we do a lot of that in the Department of Defense, but we had to do it, but I've never had to do it across the whole of government. Again, with so many different cultures, breaking down those walls. And a lot of folks would say, well, it's easy. You got a mission to do and you're trying to save lives. Well, sure. And I would offer that's a very DoD perspective. And I'm not saying it's the wrong perspective. It's a perspective I have, but believe it or not every person over here from outside our culture sees it that way. And so getting them to step up and raise their game is a leadership challenge, convincing them that it's the right thing to do, convincing them that, selling them on ideas, on ways to improve processes. Because I mentioned earlier, I'll pick on Health and Human Services and I'll pick on FEMA to a degree. That core logistics capability, that hardcore, if you will, knuckle dragon supply chain, I want to do end-to-end management, move things. That is not an expertise, a piece or a series of skill sets or expertise that is resident in Health and Human Services. And I digress, we're working to try to help them hire people to do that. We've written them position descriptions and et cetera, so they can bring in that experts, but that was not residents here. So again, getting those folks to understand the bigger picture and, the difference between supply management and supply chain management, because there's a difference. And it's not a play on words. Supply management is like warehouse management. They do that, okay. Supply chain management, not so much. And so you've got to getting them to understand that and see that big picture, and then coaching them. So we just don't have to keep coming over here all the time to try to, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just being blunt, so that they can stand on their own feet, again, through hiring experts or understanding what the bigger picture is has been a challenge, but it's something that we got to continue to work through as leaders. So I hope that all made sense. But you definitely got to exercise every leadership skill set that you either learned through professional military education, through experience. But at the end of the day, a lot of it boils down to people and understanding people and being empathetic. So, don't get me wrong, I get frustrated many times where, because we kind of violated the first role of a task force because we didn't establish the right command and control. So we don't have the authorities that people may think. We don't control the funding. So we're all about collaboration, cajoling, and coordination, which is good. But being empathetic and understanding that person's role and listening to them has made a lot of money on the non-DoD side, because you don't come in big and you don't come in forceful. You show that you want to be a team player. You show that you are considerate of their thoughts, and then you work to convince them on a way to go. Then there's some negotiation. Life's a little bit about give and take. But you ultimately end up getting where you want, and everybody kind of high fives at the end. They're like, okay, we got there. So maybe exhausting sometimes, but we get there. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, sir.
It's great research paper when this is all over with. Let me tell you. So if there's any AFIC kids out there who are looking for a topic, I got one for you. And I got gobs of data if you want.
Sounds good, sir. All right, we're wrapping up. We're getting to the last question here.
Uh-oh.
All right, sort of a three-part question, but
oh my gosh, this is like Rodney Dangerfield and Back to School.
well, it's a list. So going forward from here, based on your experiences over the last year, what are the top three things we can do better to prepare for another event of this type?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because I was working on an executive order paper we have to turn in Friday where we highlighted that. And so big thing is, at least from a pandemic standpoint, from a medical standpoint, building a medical industrial base complex, because as I mentioned before, believe it or not, we don't have one to the extent that people thought, at least for cheap disposable items, if you will. But those are the items that were needed to save people's lives, along with obviously some hardcore medical devices. Everybody's heard about ventilators, but sustaining that medical industrial base is number one. I think if you're going to manage a public health emergency, you've got to robust the health and human services folks out with providing them with those hardcore experts, if you will, and not emergency management. I mean, that's what the focus is on, or the medical side, but the no kidding like operations experts, if you will, which could be supply chain folks. It could be just more data analytics folks, but folks who can really help run and influence operations is key. And then that visibility over the, not just supply chains, but visibility over the industrial base complex, so that you can understand where the challenges are, where things may stovepipe, or not stovepipe, where there may be constraints, where things may be failing. That is the key. And so there's, our team put together what we call an industrial analysis section that we're hoping that Asper, well, not hoping, that Asper's agreed to it. Now we just got to get them to hire people and get some contractors on board to have robust it out and give them the skill sets. But it's essentially what I described on the last part. So somebody who's always working the supply chain and understands the market, somebody who understands the foreign impacts to that market, somebody who understands or is watching the political or weather type impacts to that market, understands the workforce. Is it so specialized that we're just not going to be able to hire the people in this nation to do it? Or is it localized in the wrong area? I mean, there was at one point, we opted to fund a factory up in a portion of the United States, I won't say where. And then when we looked around to try to expand it, they didn't have enough qualified workers in the area. They had to bus them from another city. And we didn't have a choice because we needed the material that they were going to produce. So, but understanding those workforce dynamics, understanding scalability, capacity, capability, those are things. But one of the things that I know they have learned really hard is, and we've all learned, is because these lessons are all the same in the Department of Defense. Doesn't matter, again, what that commodity is, medical industrial base, defense industrial base, who cares? I mean, it's still an industrial base that you got to manage. You have got to work it all the time. And so you can't be a reactionary organization who's waiting for the request to come in and then I'm going to go work it and I'm going to go figure it out. You've got to be every day understanding your market, ever how you do that. If that means you got to partner with commerce and trade, and FDA has quite a bit of capability on the supply chain side to get the data that you need and so that you can understand what those dynamics are going to be, then you got to do it. You can't take a month off. You got to just be working it all the time to understand, so that when there is a crisis concern, whether it's regional or national, you understand what you can provide to support the requirement, and you know how fast you can go. So just like a near peer fight, right? So at the end of the day, on a near peer fight, you're gonna go 0 to 60 in like 1 second. Because all of a sudden things are going to happen and people are going to be moving and they're going to be deploying, and it's not going to be like, you get 60, 90 days to get out there. You're going to have to go now. Well, a medical emergency like that in the United States is the same way. You just can't look back and say, okay, well, I'll wait for the factories to 60, 90 days to catch up. And then we'll start issuing stuff out. So, live with what you got for a little bit. So you got to start doing that planning now. To understand both what is my ramp up capacity, what's my market, what's my ramp up capacity, and then what do I need to have either on the shelf or somehow to mitigate that ramp up time so I can get there. Seems really simple, but the hard piece is the no kidding hardcore data analytics that says what are those key items, because not everything's a key item. Everybody may not believe that, but not everything's a key item. You got to focus on those key items to make sure that you're ready to go, so you can sustain the fight. And it's the same on the medical side. So that's the way we look at it. It's you got to understand the demand. So we broke it down. We broke it down in like 4 areas. So you got to understand the demand. You got to know what your supply is. You got to know what your ramp up time is. And then, at least in this case, for the strategic national stockpile, it determines what we need to have on the shelf so that we can mitigate that ramp up time and make sure we're good to go. And it's not just on the the finished product side. It's the raw material side. So I know we do that pretty good, and we have a lot of that already in the Department of Defense. I would argue we could always do better. And but that does not exist, at least on the medical side. But we're trying to get there. So long-winded answer, sorry. But thank you for indulging me.
No problem, sir. Thanks for answering all of our questions today. Do you have anything you want to provide before we close up? Anything you're dying to tell Log Nation about your experience?
First of all, I want to thank again our Logistics Officers Association for putting on just another great event, working through the adversity that COVID has brought on this great event, and an event that we all as the Logging Nation look forward to every year. Another phenomenal job by Jason Kalin and the team. I want to thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Abby Johnson, for being the interviewer, giving me the opportunity to talk, not asking any softball questions. Thank you. But no, I appreciate the time, appreciate the interaction. I just want to leave with a thank you to everybody. The team's been up here for about a year, and so we've had great support from our fellow airmen, just through emails and notes and stuff to let us know that they're thinking about us and wish us the best. And so that's very rewarding for us. This has been a great opportunity in my life. I never would have thought I would be afforded this type of opportunity, or to engage at the levels of government that I did, or I've had the opportunities to help people like we have. At the end of the day, we are those awful casualty statistics that we see hurt us every day, because we want to minimize those as much as we can. And we're working hard to try to protect folks, but make sure there's an enduring capability so that we as a nation don't have to go through this again, or at least to this magnitude. But it's just been a great team to be a part of, a great joint team. Working with the FEMA folks, that was awesome. I mean, working with the Health and Human Services folks, learned quite a bit with them. Also another awesome experience. It goes back to that leadership piece. Working across those cultures was, again, something I've never done. I've done some interagency support before, but not to this level. And I'll admit, previous interagency support, our cultures were a lot more similar, at least on the special ops side, than they are up here. So just a great experience. Wouldn't have traded it. But I do look forward to getting back to the Air Force and the Logging Nation. I feel like I've been gone more than a year. But again, thank you to everybody for this opportunity. I wish everybody the best out there in virtual land. Everybody stay COVID safe. We're getting there, and hopefully by the end of summer we'll be back to a lot closer to normal than we are now.
General Sanford, thank you for virtually joining us today and sharing your very unique experiences. It's really an honor to have this opportunity, so thank you. On behalf of the executive board and all of Log Nation, we're very proud to have you representing all Loggies on the national stage right now and throughout the past year. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.